generic Tang nonprofits, and the autonomous grassroots, once upon a time, there could be no nastier indictment than to be labeled an affiliate of the state. Yet today, some of the movement's best and brightest openly, even self-confidently, claim membership in organizations whose links to the state through either public funding or through official registration with the government are unambiguous and well documented. Indeed, there are an impressive number of radical-minded grassroots groups which, while continuing to sincerely abide by the ethos of our movement, have assumed the form of a nonprofit entity. At times, NPs go by their other name, non-governmental organization, a term more commonly used in the rest of the world, which ironically underscores its complementary relationship to government. Among grassroots organizers in the United States, there is yet another moniker, 501. The grassroots parlance cuts straight to the chase, stripping the NP down to its most essential nature, that of an IRS tax category, an official registration with the U.S. government that allows, among other privileges, the accreditation needed to receive government funding, as well as the majority of funds available through private philanthropic foundations. In exchange, the grassroots NP must adopt legally binding bylaws, form a board of directors modeled after the corporation, and make its board minutes and fiscal accounting accessible to the public. While these practices were once considered anathema to the grassroots left, they are actually the long-standing rules which have governed many community organizations, particularly religious institutions and some labor unions. Fractured left, we, the left, have been described as being weak, fractured, disorganized. I attribute that to three things: COINTELPRO, 501, capitalism, deadpan Suzanne Farr, while speaking before an audience of 800 at the historic 2004 conference The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, beyond the non-profit industrial complex. Few grassroots organizers can claim a body of work more impressive than that of Farr. In addition to authoring a number of books, including Homophobia, A Weapon of Sexism, Farr served as a founding member and director of the Arkansas Women's Project for 19 years, followed by her run as the director of the Highlander Research and Education Center for nearly a decade. During her days in Arkansas, she participated in the internal struggles that eventually led the Women's Project, an anti-domestic violence organization, to adopt the NP model. After years of effectively organizing its grassroots core, the group had reached an impasse. If their movement to end violence against women was to have broader impact, then perhaps it needed to become palatable to an array of political forces outside the grassroots left. Becoming an NP would represent one major step in that direction, facilitating the political goals of credibility, the approval of churches, clubs, and even law enforcement. One at the time, it was unclear that the NP model would actually deliver on these goals. Even more uncertain was what it would take away. Eventually, time would tell. Reflecting on the oversaturation of NP models within today's leftist struggles, Farr noted, "I've seen the loss of political force and movement building. The most troubling aspect of these losses, however, is that they were not so much based on sharp differences on key political issues, but rather the dreadful competition among organizations for little pots of money." As I sat in the audience, which consisted mostly of 20-somethings who were perhaps too young to be familiar with organizational structures other than the NP, Farr's words seemed to me something akin to tough love. 20 years ago the left made a decision to go down a certain road. Yeah, there were some small victories, but also a great number of casualties. When were we going to talk about what we had lost? Open dialogues on the myriad challenges posed by the NP have repeatedly taken a back seat to the exigencies of simply getting the work done, as if the form and content of struggles could somehow be separated. The problem, having gone unchecked for so long, seems now to have metastasized. And those poised to inherit the ever-growing dilemma are a new generation of grassroots leaders. Heavy legacies, those new to today's community, labor, and justice struggles are soon made aware that they bear heavy legacies. They carry forth movements that ended Jim Crow, that gave rise to the contemporary environmental justice movement, and that inspired the massive student and labor walkouts demanding an end to the U.S. war in Vietnam. Chances are, through some political education course, the young organizer will come across a good read on Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and the United Farm Workers. Eventually, She or he will learn that it was demanded of all UFW members, the majority of whom were earning the lowest of wages, to contribute regular membership dues. From the pages of history, the young organizer will hear Chavez insist, "This is the only way the workers will own the organization." Inevitably, the young organizer takes a hard look at how his or her present-day organization does business and questions the deeper strength of an organization that depends on foundation grants for its survival, that hires a development director to raise funds so that others can turn their attention to the real work, and that adopts management systems which are foreign, if not alienating, to the values and skill sets of the base. This self-inventory leads to even more questions. Why do we apply for a police permit to protest the police? Because if we break the law, our board is liable. Why can't we lobby? Because that would violate our C3 status and the conditions of our grant. Why not just take the streets? Because insurance doesn't cover it. Nonprofit blues, the NP is cast as the straw man against which a multitude of political frustrations can be vented. Indeed, the severe limitations placed on today's left calls not only for defense against right-wing attack, but also for exercising those untidy internal contradictions. And here the NP serves as very effective foil, for few will deny the ways in which it keeps in check the left's more radical impulses, or even, at times, its basic common sense. While we have yet to precisely assess just how far and wide the trouble with the NP has spread throughout the left, my own empirical survey, gleaned from the opportunity one had these days to meet and support numerous grassroots youth groups across the country, indicates that the NP poses as many challenges to organizing as it does solutions. Indeed, the majority of organizational leaders I've sat down with over the past year and a half, whose work ranges from defeating the onset of neoliberal policies in public schools to the ongoing struggle against police violence to defending the rights of immigrant communities, have experienced, to varying degrees, an onset of the NP blues. They are concerned about the ways in which the priorities of philanthropy tamper with the organizing work, or how NP governance makes impossible the principle of unity, which calls for youth and working-class people at the center, or worse, how hiring and promotion policies have led to competition and individualism among the ranks. Still, despite the seeming ubiquity of the dilemma, a broad and consistent public discussion is absent. Each finds his or her own way to manage the contradictions. In my conversations with participants who attended the Revolution Will Not Be Funded conference, many lefties talked of participating in the NP as a tactic on the down low, a temporary ride toward a more radical end. Yet candid discussions on just how long we ride this Trojan horse, or how far we've actually traveled, are few and far between. A related but more pragmatic view suggests that NPs provide the only spaces in right-dominated times to do meaningful work. That's the take the money and run, and build what you can now attitude, according to scholar-activist Ruthie Gilmore. But here, too, there's a silence, as a deeper discussion is missing. What's our ultimate purpose? Where are we running to? For those who have steadfastly refused to go NP, they, too, maintain silence for the most part. But at times their reticence comes off as gracious condescension. Let the wayward NP reformists and revisionists do their thing. Eventually they'll come round. Perhaps it would be beneficial to examine the historical origin of this conflict, located at the dawn of the Reagan era in the early to mid-1980s. It was the moment in which several forces within the new left decided to turn down the NP road. What were the internal conditions that led to that turn? At least three interrelated factors influenced this trend: deconsolidation of the party builders and the proliferation of new social movements, baby boomers with loot, and the legitimacy question. Deconsolidate and proliferate. Throughout much of the 1970s, there was a strong current within the new left that sought to harness and consolidate the political energies of the late 1960s into a revolutionary party. The years 1965 to 1969 saw the rise of numerous liberation struggles led by groups such as the Black Panther Party, as well as the more visibly fragmented women's and queer liberation movements, and of course, the meteoric rise of the anti-war movement. Max Albaum, an activist who has chronicled the new communist movement, describes the period as being one with revolution in the air. It was a feeling, a texture, of multiple resistances, each with its own brilliance and complexity. Point 3. By the 1970s, many of the self-identified revolutionary forces within this new left turned their attention to party-building efforts aimed at consolidating the many movements in order to strike a unified revolutionary blow against the establishment. But for some, party-building came at the cost of taking away valuable time and attention from community-based struggles. For others, it meant erasing or subordinating the particular character of race, gender, sexual, and class oppression for the sake of a higher degree of unity. And for others still, party building would mark the beginning of deep sectarian fighting between different cadres, not to mention the nasty conflicts and abuses of power within parties and revolutionary organizations. The troubled efforts of the party builders paralleled the rise and proliferation of NSMs, led by those who had either departed from, resisted, or simply ignored the push to consolidate the Revolutionary Party, and instead continued to organize on the ground, as it were throughout the 70s. By the early 1980s, with many party-building efforts in decline, the NSMs continued to grow and proliferate, codifying their struggles under new banners. Among the more popular and lasting issue areas were environmental justice, racial justice, no nukes, housing organizing, youth development, and community economic development. These would, in turn, become the social justice silos that guided the funding strategies of philanthropic foundations. Baby boomers with loot. Yet who are the people behind these foundations who donate a portion of their excesses to the grassroots? And since when do the wealthy give generously to progressive, let alone radical, causes? The New Left was one part of a broader countercultural movement whose core consisted largely of middle-class youth, along with a few children of the wealthy. By the 1980s, many of the baby boomers born to wealth were inheriting portions of their family's estate. Those still partially faithful to their movement values became reliable individual donors to NSM struggles close to their hearts. And those with serious loot established family foundations, nonprofit institutions that do the work of finding and funding innovative projects. Because the vast majority of these foundations can only give grants to groups with NP status, the past 20 years has seen the rapid proliferation of nonprofits among politically progressive to radical sectors. Between 1975 and 1988, the total number of philanthropic foundations in the United States grew from 21,887 to 30,388. By 2000, that number had jumped to 56,582.4. Many of these were family foundations, signaling a new, albeit small and selective, funding source for the grassroots. This was a much-needed respite for community-based struggles, weathering the cutbacks to federally funded anti-poverty programs that were originally designed under the Kennedy-Johnson Great Society era before being cut down by Reagan. Legitimacy. During the same period, many activists on the left began to insist that in order to have impact, the movement needed to take on the sharper image. It needed to get with the times and make an impression on institutional power as opposed to being its incessant pain in the ass. Instead of malmawing the suits for big promises that amounted to mere breadcrumbs, it was suggested that the left try donning a suit and grabbing a seat at the table to win big. The penultimate examples of this are the former New Lefties who ran for political office during the 1980s and 90s, deciding to work with, instead of against, the Democratic Party. For others, the mission was to start influential 220, the revolution will not be funded nonprofit organizations that could press for the incremental gains that would perhaps lead, finally, to those Marxian qualitative leaps. Of course, there were those who pleaded in vain with their erstwhile comrades not to go the route of legitimacy, to hold out just a little longer. For many of them, the story abruptly ends here. Their generation simply sold out, as the crabby expression goes, forever abandoning the good idea of revolution. But sellout talk does little to guide us through our present-day dilemmas. In many ways, it's a lot like breakup talk doing the work of suturing hurt feelings, adjudicating quick and easy verdicts, and above all, obscuring complicated truths. The whole sellout theory crowds out the discussion of burnout, remarks Makani Thembenixon, director of the Washington, D.C.-based Praxis Project. Point 5 in evoking the burnout. She's referring not only to those who failed to pace themselves and in the end ran out of gas, but also to those who, during their days in various revolutionary parties and collectives, were burned by internal political processes and abuses of institutional authority, either individual or collective, that resulted in many members wanting and needing alternative spaces to carry forth their work. According to Thembenixen, women in particular needed a way to from the sexism, the exploitation, the rough stuff that would play out within self-identified revolutionary organizations. At times, these heretofore internal matters were more the issue behind people leaving than the external politics of any given group. The emergence of the NP therefore provided the opportunity to continue to do smart work, practical work, in a way that allowed you to survive. This was especially important after witnessing those who did not survive. Thembenixen offers a crucial rebuttal to those who would reduce the N-turn to the defeatist attitude of a generation that had grown politically soft. Moreover, for those whose frustration with the NP has now reached its limit, prompting the call for the left's full retreat from this particular industrial complex, something like a moratorium on NPS, her reflections on recent history caution us that the matter is far more complicated. After all, what would today's left look like had its grassroots never adopted the NP structure, staying faithful to a purist notion of organizational forms unmediated by the government or philanthropic sectors, those lauded for being entirely by, of, and for the people? Would it be inoculated from the sharp power imbalances, competitiveness, and even the internal exploitation of members that is so often the basis criticism against overly professionalized NPs? A dubious claim at best. One could even infer that it is precisely the new left's failure to implement and sustain these anti-hierarchical principles, to care for the long-term development and health of all its members, to promote a movement culture wherein folks from many walks of life could contribute in a variety of ways, that led to the sweeping NP phenomena we're seeing today. Civil society on the horizon these days. There's a small movement storm brewing in Atlanta, Georgia. From June 27th through July 1st, 2007, the city will play host to the first United States Social Forum, a gathering projected at 20,000 participants from a wide cross-section of the grassroots. Labor, environmental justice, immigrant rights, racial justice, anti-war, youth and student, women, queer, and international solidarity, to name but a few. Although the USSF will not take up resolving the NP dilemma as a stated objective or thematic area, it may nonetheless shed some much-needed light on the matter. By bringing together the heart and soul of the grassroots left, the event will explore the promise of its future movements and, consequently, the many obstacles and contradictions that stand in the way of fulfilling that promise. What organizational forms the movement chooses, how it ultimately proposes to structure itself, seems an unavoidable issue. Moreover, there is an ever-advancing global phenomenon propelling this discussion. The USSF is an official regional forum of the World Social Forum, which for the past 6 years has coalesced social movements from around the world to discuss an array of locally derived global strategies to defeat the agendas of world trade, war, and the new imperialism. The groups that compose this new global movement are not political parties or government representatives of left-leaning nation-states. Rather, they consider themselves part of a new civil society, an array of locally based struggles and supporting NGOs that seek varying degrees of political autonomy from the nation-state, the freeing of indigenous lands, and the end to territorial domination by transnational corporations. On January 1st, 1994, the world caught a glimpse of this new civil society in action, as a relatively small band of indigenous Mayan freedom fighters from the state of Chiapas, Mexico, led the once improbable people's uprising against globalization. Over the next decade, the struggle of the Zapatistas would introduce millions to the notion of a fourth world war being waged against the world's poorest communities by the global corporate elite. For example, neoliberal policies, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, have enabled transnational corporations to steal indigenous land and labor, forcing subsistence-based agrarian communities into market system dependence, largely through the privatization of natural resources. Moreover, the Zapatistas would advance the idea that those who were to defend the people in this new war were not the national liberation armies of old, those for whom the goal was to capture state power, but rather a new Mexican civil society comprised of indigenous social movements completely independent of the public and private sectors, as well as non-indigenous Mexican civilian groups who saw their own futures inextricably linked to that of the indigenous struggle against neoliberalism. Among these groups are Mexican NGOs who support the work of these movements in a variety of ways. No sooner had the Zapatista Army of National Liberation seized several cities in Chiapas during its New Year's Day offensive than it deferred the position of revolutionary vanguard to civil society. The revolution would not be about a military campaign to capture the nation-state town by town, region by region. Rather, it would be a chain of communities across which the notion of civilian autonomy in the face of neoliberalism would spread like wildfire. Each community would, through locally derived efforts, resist the conquering of their land. In the words of the Zapatistas, indigenize the nation, indigenize the world. Complementary roles under the auspices of Mexican civil society, the autonomous social movement, and the institutionalized NGO strive for balance. Each understands the specific and complementary role it plays in articulating the new social formation. The former shapes the ethos of a struggle, does the work of locating power among those most afflicted by the onset of neoliberalism. The latter, on the other hand, understands that it is not the subject of the social movement for autonomy, but rather the political and technical support for it. From its specific location, the NGO leverages funds to the autonomous movements, helps the movement build connections to those beyond the borders of the nation-state, provides training, education, and infrastructural support, the development of health clinics, schools, alternative media centers, and, at times, serves as liaison between government officials and the autonomous movements. Yet, before we take heart that the new paradigm of civil society and its WSF provide a solution for our generation, it is worth noting that, here too, contradictions abound. The WSF has been criticized for being overrun by NGOs, most of whom can afford to send large delegations by plane, while the members of their nation's autonomous movements have less access, often arriving to the forum after weeks of traveling over rough terrain. Many have trouble affording the costs of the WSF upon arrival. What's more, the balance of civil society illustrated by the Zapatistas' vision for Mexico is not usually the case in many a global South country, nor is it without contention in Mexico itself. There are indeed NGOs throughout Latin America, Asia, and Africa that have come under fire for at times tipping the balance and eclipsing the autonomous movements. Writer, activist Arundhati Roy, for example, has been a particularly harsh critic of NGOs operating in India, noting the ways in which they often serve neoliberalism's drive toward expropriating land and privatizing national industries in the name of development. At the same time, Roy, though known internationally for her literary achievements, became something of a global movement icon herself when, during the 2003 WSF, she delivered one of the most passionate and memorable speeches the international left had heard in quite some time. 6. However, for the U.S. left, adopting the concept of civil society wherein the NPs play a specific and complementary role in relation to the autonomous grassroots may prove valuable to those attempting to navigate their way through today's movement-building dilemmas. Take a moment to imagine yourself, 20 years ago, in a room full of U.S. leftists discussing strategies for moving forward in a country drifting ever rightward. Few of you would conjure the image of lefties sitting around the table, envisaging a vast army of NPs leading the people's revolution. To be sure, the left's present oversubscription to the NP was never the intended course. Yet today, U.S.-based NPs find themselves awkwardly at the movement center. There is little to distinguish between autonomous grassroots and the NP. To illustrate the point, if one today were to conduct a peer-to-peer exchange between a U.S.-based grassroots organization and, say, members of Brazil's landless movement, chances are the U.S. representative would belong to the NP group. Here, the goal of striking a balance of arriving at clear roles to be played by autonomous movements and NGOs, respectively, is an impossibility because the border between the categories has been blurred to the point of irrelevance. We never had the 501 from the beginning, says Jerome Scott, as he reflects on his organization's 20-year history. The organization is Project South 8 based in Atlanta, and it will play the role of anchor organization for the USSF. An auto worker and shop floor organizer from Detroit, Scott once participated in the famous Wildcat strikes of 1973, led in part by the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. In the late 1970s, he relocated to the Southeast, where things were a bit more raw. By the early 1980s, the Southeast was experiencing major political backlash against the gains of the civil rights movement. Scott, along with several comrades from Detroit who had also made their way down south, began organizing campaigns to bring attention to the profound poverty, unemployment, and racism that characterized the post-civil rights era. The founding of Project South can be viewed as the continuation of Scott and his comrades' efforts back in Detroit to build independent movements. During the first 10 years of its existence, Project South was not an NP, nor did it receive significant grants from foundations or individual donors. The work was carried out by a collective of volunteer activists, organizers, and visionaries. In 224, the revolution will not be funded was only in 1995, long after the organization had been on the radar of many progressive philanthropy groups eager to fund it, that Project South decided to incorporate as an NP. According to Scott, this decision represented not so much a political shift within the organization, but rather exemplified how an organization may respond to, if not capitalize upon, significant shifts within the broader political culture. By the mid-1990s, with the conservative movement in full swing, the attack on big government had made a real impact. With less public funds available to support even the most modest programs aimed at social equity, the realm of progressive, private philanthropy expanded. As such, it comes as little surprise that some private foundations sought to support the vision and work of Project South. The challenge for the organization, according to Scott, was in how to become a 501 without losing sight of the mission. By taking the 501 status, we could not be deterred from our vision and how we do our work, Scott said. We made a conscious decision to keep on doing the work in the way we believe it needs to happen. If this means that we're not following the 501 rules, well then they can just come right over and take our status away from us. Today, despite maintaining a staff of 6, a large office within a community space, and the support of several foundations, Project South likes to think of itself as operating outside the NP box. Flying in the face of traditional NP policies and practices, it insists on salary parity for all staff, regardless of work experience. In its public materials, the organization boldly describes the situation facing Southern blacks as a genocide, while most other NPs would choose the more acceptable if not cautious structural inequality. And it feels emboldened to engage in a range of political tactics, some of which are strictly forbidden for 501 organizations. Yet for all its unorthodoxies, Project South harbors no illusions of itself as some kind of rarefied movement vehicle the autonomous grassroots in NP drag. The 501 is not a movement and cannot make the movement, Scott observed. And here, he includes Project South in this crowded field of 501s. When asked where, then, he believes this movement actually resides, Scott offers that it's in a low stage of development, it's unformed and inarticulate, thus allowing for the seeming dominance of the NPs. But things are stirring, he adds. For Scott, the hope is that other forms of autonomous struggle, independent of NPs, will continue to grow and push forward. The role of Project South and other NP institutions would therefore become complementary, supplemental, or supportive to the movement, one of several means of tilting the broader political spectrum toward liberation politics. In conclusion, perhaps a worthy goal for today's movement-oriented NPs is to somehow self-correct the stark imbalance that presently exists between 501s and the autonomous grassroots, to do the work of ensuring that autonomous struggles become not only visible but the generative force behind a future movement that will bring about tremendous change. There's an ontological question embedded here. Can the NP give life to that which is a precondition of its own existence? The NP can clear a path for revolutionary change by dismantling the policies and practices that prevent autonomous movements taking hold in the U.S. from the Electoral College to the denial of proportional representation, to the collapse of the social welfare state, to the rollback on civil rights. So, too, it can do the work of coalescing grassroots forces at opportune times, a prime example being the U.S. Social Forum. And at the very least, it can challenge the left's discernible shift toward purely elitist strategies, pushing legislative policy, gaining elections in swing states, winning over the commercial media practices, which eclipse the mass strategy of gradually building the base of opposition over time, of truly investing in change from below. Acknowledgments. A version of his chapter first appeared as a feature-length article in Left Turn, number 18. It is reprinted here with the permission of the author in Left Turn. Notes: 1. Susan Farr. 2. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. 3. Max Albaum, Revolution in the Air. 60s Radicals Turn to Lenin, Mao, and Che. For these statistics are gleaned from the Foundation Center, Foundation Yearbook, Facts and Figures on Private and Community Foundations. 5. Makani Thembenixon, interview by Eric Tang, August 15, 2005. 6. Arundhati Roy, Confronting Empire. Reprinted in Arundhati Roy, War Talk, 103-112. 7. Jerome Scott, interview by Eric Tang, August 20, 2005. 8. For more information about Project South, see their essay Fundraising is Not a Dirty Word, which appears in this volume.